Good evening. I'm David Magleby, the Dean of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, the 7th annual Marjorie Pay Hinckley Lecture. We're pleased to have here this evening President Cecil O. Samuelson, a member of the 70 and president of BYU, and his wife Sharon, along with Sister Rosemary Wixom, general president of the primary, and her husband Jack, and Sister Cheryl Esplin, second counselor in the general primary presidency, and her husband Max. We welcome Elder Ben Banks, an emeritus 70, and his wife Susan. Also in attendance this evening is former academic vice president John Tanner and his wife Susan, and associate academic vice president Craig Hart and his wife Kirsten. We are pleased that 2 of President and Sister Hinckley's 5 children and their spouses or guests are here tonight. 3 of Sister Hinckley's siblings are also with us this evening, as well as several of Sister Hinckley's grandchildren. Welcome to you all. We also extend a warm welcome to faculty, students, and members of the community, and hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. Our invocation this evening will be offered by Ashley Kearns, a family life student from Harvest, Alabama. We express appreciation to the Hinckley Chair Advisory Committee, Jane Dudley, John Hoffman, Gordon Lim, Ginny Roby, Richard Miller, Diane Spangler, and Tina Dykes, for their ongoing work in overseeing this wonderful resource. Much of tonight's event was organized by Kim Reed, Patricia Wilson, and Robin Shumway of the Dean's Office. We express appreciation also to Charlene Clark and Lisa Willey of the School of Social Work for their help in directing the students, and as well as students from the School of Social Work and our Student College Council serving as ushers. They're the ones who've gotten you all so nicely organized compactly in your chairs. Thank you all. Please join me in expressing appreciation to the Dean's Office staff and the School of Social Work staff for all they've done to make tonight's event a successful event. We are honored in the college to be able to help perpetuate Sister Marjorie Pay Hinckley's legacy through this chair. Tonight's Marjorie Pay Hinckley lecture will be delivered by Dr. Ross Thompson, professor of psychology and director of the Social and Emotional Development Lab at the University of California, Davis. We are pleased that Dr. Thompson's wife, Janet, is with us this evening. Professor Thompson will be introduced by Professor Laura Walker of the School of Family Life. Laura?
I've been given the pleasure this evening of introducing the speaker for the 7th annual Marjorie Pay Hinckley Lecture, Dr. Ross Thompson, professor of psychology and director of the Social and Emotional Development Lab at the University of California, Davis. I have the special privilege of having had Ross as my graduate mentor when I was working on my PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So please forgive me if I intersperse his impressive accomplishments with ways in which he's personally influenced my life and the life of countless other students. Dr. Thompson studies early parent-child relationships and the development of emotional understanding, regulation, and early moral development as they relate to policy concerns such as school readiness and early mental health. Dr. Thompson serves on the Scientific Advisory Board of the National Institute for Early Education Research and is a founding member of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. Dr. Thompson has testified before Congress and state legislatures, lectured internationally, and is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. He's written countless professional research articles and numerous books on children's early socio-emotional development and has co-authored several best-selling undergraduate textbooks on child development and lifespan development. Dr. Thompson has been a visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development and Education in Berlin, a senior NIMH fellow in law and psychology at Stanford University, and a Harris Visiting Professor at the University of Chicago. He also received the Anne Brown Award for Excellence in Developmental Research in 2007. Dr. Thompson is one of those rare academics who excels at both research and teaching. and was a member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he spent over 20 years of his career, and where he received the Outstanding Research and Creative Activity Award. Dr. Thompson teaches large sections of Introduction to Psychology, so about 500 students a semester. And he's very well known for his exemplary teaching, both inside and outside of the classroom. I remember Dr. Thompson literally spending hours with me every week, helping to determine my research interests and shaping me into the educator that I am today. As his teaching assistant, he and I would often debate the deserved consequences of one of our freshman students who turned in a late assignment or who had failed to follow the directions. And Dr. Thompson was instrumental in teaching me how to balance justice and mercy so that I could optimize learning, although I'm pretty sure some of my current students might say I need a refresher while he's here visiting. Dr. Thompson's interactions with students and individuals clearly set him apart in the field, and I and countless others can see his influence in our research trajectories, in our teaching abilities, not to mention in who we are as individuals and parents. Thus, it's my honor to introduce you to my beloved mentor, my distinguished colleague, and my friend, Dr. Ross Thompson.
What a wonderful introduction. How sweet. Well, I am honored, deeply honored, to be asked to be with you this evening, and particularly to do so on this occasion when I am asked to speak as part of a set of activities that honor this remarkable woman for whom it is named. As one of the preparations I did for anticipating this time with you, I came to get to know Marjorie Hinckley through her writings, through the DVD that you saw, and came to deeply admire both who she was as a person, who she is, and what she has brought to all of you. So it is a double honor for me to be asked to speak on this particular occasion in her honor as well. This is not my first visit to Brigham Young, and the warmth and the generosity of spirit of those that I encounter when I am here each time always make me look forward to the next visit and has helped to contribute to my anticipation of the wonderful time that Janet and I have had here. Thank you all so very much. I think you would agree with me that we live in historic times. We live in times that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to be reading about and studying. We live in historic times because of the tumultuous events of the Middle East that we are learning about even this week. We live in historic times because of a historically unique national recession in our economy that we are digging through. We live in historic times because of our own domestic politics, and well, who knows, we may be living in historic times now if Brigham Young University ends up in the NCAA Final Four. Oh, that would happen. Go Jimmer. I want to argue that we live in historic times for another reason as well, and this has to do with the changes that are taking place in our understanding of early childhood development. We are moving to a place of new understanding of the importance of early childhood for lifespan, health, and development. And we will never go back again to the days in which we used to think that nothing much of importance happens in the early years that makes a difference for the rest of life. Your understanding of this, you're acquainted with this because you know some of the reasons that our changing understanding of early childhood development is taking place right before our eyes. One of those reasons, of course, is the new research on the explosive development of the brain that takes place in the early years of life, that lays a foundation for lifelong achievement, health, and well-being. You also know that our national focus on school readiness, built on the brain development research, is part of what has drawn our attention to the early years as a period of preparation, not just for school, but also for lifelong achievement. And indeed, these changes in our understanding of early childhood development have changed our thinking about what young children are like. We now talk about the scientist in the crib, or in other contexts about the philosophical baby, in appreciation of the remarkable powers of observation, inference, and insight that even are revealed in the casual play of a young baby and are revealing an incredibly powerful brain and mind at work. Now, these changes that I've been talking about are familiar to most of us because they have been unfolding for many years. But I would argue that we are in the midst of a third reason for historic changes in our thinking about children that is less familiar to us because it is building on research that we are currently in the midst of uncovering, and it has to do with children's emotions. We are discovering now, in research that is taking place in our lab and in research labs throughout the country, about the powerful role of emotions in forging social attachments in early relationships, in the emergence of social understanding, the importance of emotions for creating the foundations of psychological adjustment, and even providing a basis for cognitive competence and academic achievement. This new appreciation of young children's emotional life is moving us beyond the old days in which we saw children's feelings to reflect the primitive, the irrational, or the egocentric character of childhood immaturity. And they're moving us to a new day of understanding how emotions are the constructive foundation for some of the really important achievements we care about in the early years, including morality, self-understanding, and compassion for others. But in contrast to the good news story of brain development and the good news story of school readiness that tells us how we can optimize children's internal potential, there's a dark side to these new discoveries of children's emotional lives. Because we are discovering that while emotions have the potential to contribute to some of the most constructive, positive features of early psychological development, especially when children are growing up in supportive contexts, we also know that there is a potential for emotions to undermine children's healthy development, especially when they're faced with chronic adversity and threat. So in a sense, we are realizing that there are two sides to children's emotional lives, which is contributing now to a new understanding of early childhood development. One of those sides is the emotional child, as we have traditionally seen the child, with strong feelings that can take children to the peaks of ecstasy and the depths of sadness and can often be overwhelming. And new discoveries about the emotional child are giving us a new appreciation of the depth but also the vulnerability of young children's emotional lives. And then there is the emotionate child, another side of emotional development, which reflects new research on the importance of early emotional experiences as sources of social understanding and human connections to others. And so I'd like this evening to talk with you about these two sides of early emotional development, and also to talk about the implications, particularly of the emotionate child, for the development of self, morality, and social and emotional understanding. Let's turn first then to the emotional child. As long as people have written about children, emotions have been prominent in their descriptions. A couple of centuries ago, Jean-Jacques Rousseau described childhood in his famous novel Emile as a time when laughter is ever on the lips and when the heart is ever at peace, setting the stage for Victorian and post-Victorian sentimentality concerning children and children's emotions. But that's not the whole story, of course. Shortly afterwards, Freud began reminding us about the id-dominated young child who is utterly consumed with irrational emotionality and the relentless pursuit of gratification until the ego develops. Emotion, often seen as irrational, disorganizing, or upsetting, has long characterized how we have, all of us, thought about the nature of childhood, consistent with our prevalent portrayals of young children as carefree, egocentric, or under-controlled. This is an important part of the story of emotional development and has been given added insight recently by studies of children who are now studying in stressful circumstances. What we're discovering is that early emotional problems can be serious, especially for children under stress. We know, for example, from recent studies that roughly 10% of children in kindergarten show disruptive emotional or behavioral problems. Those of you who teach young children know how significant these can be in a classroom. For lower income children, the prevalence is double or triple this estimate. Head Start teachers are reporting to us that their children exhibit signs of serious emotional distress, including depression, withdrawal, and problems with aggression and antisocial behavior. More recently, studies from developmental neuroscience are telling us that chronic, uncontrollable stress experiences in early childhood, what I call toxic stress, to distinguish it from ordinary stress, can actually alter brain-based stress management systems, contributing to emotional dysregulation with the potential for impairing long-term learning and health. In the old days, we used to think that children are untouched by trouble, much the same way that water floats off a duck's back. We believe that although young children can feel and express their distress, their rage, their frustration, their sadness, their fear, and sometimes their joy with a great intensity, that they recover quickly, and within minutes, it seems, are ready to go back to play. But we are increasingly finding that when children do not have supportive relationships to help them in emotion management, early experiences of stress can have long-term consequences. And this new view, this new understanding of early emotional life and of the emotional child is telling us something new. That yes, the emotional lives of young children are deep and rich, but they are also vulnerable. And this is leading us now to ask new questions of early childhood that we would not have ever thought to begin asking when I was first a student studying children in this area. One of those questions was profiled not long ago in a cover story in the Sunday New York Times. And the question was quite simply, can preschoolers be depressed? When I was in graduate school, not so long ago, we were assured that preschoolers could certainly not get depressed because they lacked the psychological maturity to experience the depths of grief and sadness that true depression entails. And part of the reason we felt that way long ago was that young children can often manifest their signs of depression or anxiety in ways that are quite different from how adults show the same kinds of emotional turmoil, so their symptoms were relatively easy to overlook. But partly as a result of very careful studies conducted over the last 5 years by colleagues of mine who have looked carefully at how young children with emotional problems manifest them, we now have much more valid and reliable means of identifying early emotional problems when they occur. And when we compare the incidence rates of these common psychological problems in community samples of preschoolers compared to older children and adults, the results have been unsettling. With respect to depression, for example, we find rates for toddlers and preschoolers that are clearly measurable, lower than what we find in older children and adults, but clearly apparent. Yes, preschoolers can get depressed. And even more disturbing is the fact that we are also observing behavioral indicators of depression in infants and toddlers, especially those who are in the care of a depressed mother. With respect to anxiety disorders, the concern is even more unsettling because we are finding that prevalence rates for toddlers and preschoolers are actually higher than those for children and adolescents, although lower than those of adults. And when we compare these three age groups, for the overall incidence of any psychological problem, here's what we find. More than 16% of community samples of young children are showing signs of serious psychological and emotional disturbance, many of these coming from troubled families or dangerous neighborhoods. Now, the conclusion that young children can have serious emotional problems is new news to most of us, and it's important news for understanding that children can be affected by the stresses and adversity that they sometimes encounter. But this is not new news to those who work with children in these settings. When I talk to California preschool teachers throughout the state, when I speak nationally to early education groups, and I talk about the effects of early stress, what I typically get is a knowing nod. They've seen these children. And when I consult with my colleagues who have rescued children in the wake of natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, they say this is exactly what they see, especially when these children have lost access to the adults who provide them with support. The good news in this picture is that we know that there are promising forms of assistance. A recent report from the National Academy of Sciences reports that the greatest opportunities for supportive strategies for prevention, intervention, and treatment are those that begin in early childhood, when the brain is still plastic, when children can respond still with some resilience. That's good news. But the best prevention strategy, of course, is to build in young children the sources of emotional health and well-being that will help them stand resilient and strong when adversity comes. And this brings us to the other side of early emotional development, the emotionate child. Now, I understand there have been some questions here about what do we mean by the emotionate child, so I provided a dictionary definition for you. We can characterize emotionate as being characterized by emotional apperception, sensitivity, or insight, as in her sympathetic response showed that she was an emotionate child. Or emotionate can be defined as marked by special bearing upon reference to or involvement with emotional understanding, as in an emotionate side to his nature. Clearly, by emotionate, we don't mean the old image of the emotional child, who pointed us to the vulnerability and stress of early emotional life. By emotionate child, we're referring to the emotional resources that are the basis for the human connections that children share with other people, that provide them with social support and understanding, that motivate compassion and helping from an early age, and that form the positive foundation for morality and emotional health. And so the question we might ask then is, how does the emotionate child develop? We see the growth of the emotional child virtually from birth, when the raucous crying of a newborn infant and the petulant fussing crying of the baby that every parent responds to clearly shows the emotional child growing up. But if we watch closely, we can also see the emotionate child developing at the same time in the baby's quiet attentiveness to the emotions of her caregivers. In fact, the most remarkable discovery that we've been making is quite simply this, that emotion is a young child's first entree into another person's internal experience. And emotions thus constitute the core foundation for the psychological connections that we share with others. This starts very early. By 6 months, we know that infants respond resonantly to the facial and emotional expressions of positive and negative emotion in another. That a baby who looks at a pleasant smiling face, or even independently of that face, simply hears the melodic contours of a positive human voice, relaxes, feels at ease, sometimes expresses pleasure and joy. By contrast, a child looking into the face of an angry adult or independent of that face simply is hearing the sharp, staccato, low intonation of an angry vocal expression, even if it's in a language the child has never heard. That child tenses up, becomes wary, vigilant, uncertain, may begin to fuss. That's at 6 months of age. By 1 year of age, infants know that another's emotions are about something. People don't just feel happy or sad or afraid. They feel happy about some person. They feel afraid of an object. They feel sad about an event that the person is looking at while they're responding emotionally. And this means that infants also begin to look to the expressions of others, knowing that they're about something in the world to give them guidance about how to respond to those same objects, those same people, those same events, what we call social referencing. Throughout this period, emotions are absolutely foundational to social communication and developing relationships in a way that I'll show you in just a moment. But equally, if not more importantly, is this, that in these early social interactions, there are created intersubjective experiences that involve a connection between the internal world of another person and the child. And emotion is the gateway to that intersubjective connection. Emotions really are the language of early social communication. Now, this is one of those things that you really have to see in order to understand. And so, to illustrate, what I'd like to do is to show you a short video clip of a mother interacting with her young baby. Those of you who are students in my students' classes probably will recognize this as a still face procedure. And what I want you to notice is the degree of emotional synchrony, of intersubjectivity that exists between the mother and baby before it is experimentally disrupted by the experiment. It's going to be narrated for you, so you'll see exactly what I mean.
In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
The person who put that together, by the way, was my colleague Ed Tronick at Harvard University. And it's a vivid illustration of how emotions are the language of early human connections. And that as a child is sharing emotion with a mother who mirrors it back, is sharing attention and intention with a mother who mirrors that back, the child has the first experience of connecting with the psychological experience of another, which is, of course, the basis, eventually, for human compassion. Emotion is a child's first entree into another person's internal experience. And this developmental process continues as we move into the second year, because by 18 months, toddlers are already capable now of using another's emotion to learn about that person's desires and goals. Emotions now become the gateway to understanding other psychological states in another person. In an elegant experiment conducted by a friend of mine at Berkeley, I wish I'd thought to do this, they built on the fact that at this age, toddlers can read emotions very well. And so this experiment showed that toddlers, 18-month-olds, will give more broccoli to an adult who's shown delight in eating broccoli, even though this is a food that no toddler wants for herself. Okay? Because by this age, toddlers already know that people respond positively when they get things they want, and of course, sadly, when they get things they don't want. Now notice how non-egocentric this is. Because of course, if the toddler were responding on the basis of her own preferences, then she'd simply give goldfish crackers, which are also available to the experimenter. But in fact, she gives broccoli. Now the question is this: if toddlers will give hated broccoli to an experimenter who obviously loves it based on her emotional signals, what else might they do to be helpful to another person? We have not often asked this question in the past, partly because we've often believed that young children are too egocentric to understand how another's needs and desires and feelings may differ from their own. Yeah, it's also because toddlers aren't very good at doing things that are genuinely helpful to adults. But if young children are really attentive to other people's feelings and needs, how would they respond if we observed them in situations where they could genuinely act in a helpful manner? Would they do so? Well, my graduate student, Emily Newton, and I explored this question not long ago in our lab using some procedures we had developed with the assistance of some of our colleagues in Germany to look at helping behavior in 18-month-olds. And I'd like to show you some excerpts from our research video.
Here's one blanket. Okay. Here's the other one. Oh. 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 Now I can put my blanket in. What's that? I don't know. I just drew a swirly picture. picture?
Flower.
A flower, yeah, it does look like a flower. Oh, oh. Oh, okay, I can put it back in. I'll put this one here. And
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
okay, now I have this. I have this, okay.
This is the fun part of doing research, right? Now, let me clarify what you've seen. You've watched an 18-month-old behave altruistically to a total adult just a few minutes earlier who has offered her no rewards for doing what she's done. Emily did not thank her. Emily basically acknowledged what had happened and moved on. And that is telling us something about the sensitivity of young children. But the important thing is that you have not seen the whole story, because each of these experimental conditions in our study is paralleled by another condition in which the same context occurs, but in which Emily does not indicate cues of needing assistance. So, for example, in the instance where she drops the marker while she's drawing, there's a parallel condition in which Emily caps the marker and just tosses it on the floor, does not reach for it. Toddlers don't help in those conditions. In other words, toddlers don't have an innate need to pick up fallen markers and clothespins off the floor. Rather, toddlers provide assistance more often when the adult shows clear cues of needing assistance. They are sensitive to subtle cues of whether the adult needs help or not. Now notice that in some of the conditions, Emily looked sad as she was reaching for the fallen object. And what we found is that when the adult looked sad, the toddlers who helped the most were those who with the greatest number of emotion words in their vocabularies. Now this is important because when young children don't have a lot of language, we use things like emotion words as an index of their emotion understanding, because early language is built on your conceptual primitives, what you already can conceive, and therefore children with a greater emotion vocabulary at this age probably have a more developed understanding of emotion. So what seems to be happening here is these kids are tuning into multiple cues of an adult's need, and they're participating in those needs in order to help. Does this reflect compassion? Probably not in an 18-month-old. But we are seeing in here the foundations of the compassion that we are currently seeing in a parallel study with 4-year-olds, where kids are clearly tuning into the emotions of the adult, and that is motivating their helping. What we are seeing is intersubjectivity in an 18-month-old, to be willing to take on a stranger's needs and to respond appropriately to the stranger's emotions. Now, I mentioned the vocabulary of emotions at 18 months, and the influence of the vocabulary of emotions is not by accident. Once young children develop language skills, it contributes to their emotional understanding in multifaceted ways. It means, for example, that children now have language and words to use to categorize and organize and understand their emotions. And with those words, they can begin to comprehend the ways that my experience of sadness that went on yesterday might be like, well, it might be like my older siblings' experience of sadness that my mother just labeled while I was watching. That intersubjective connection begins to be connected by language. But even more importantly, language provides a means of sharing emotional experiences with another person. Now they're not just part of what you're experiencing, but you can share them with somebody else, and if that somebody else is responding, they can help you understand what you're experiencing. And there's considerable evidence now that these conversations about emotion begin early and are developmentally appropriate. We have recorded hundreds of these conversations in our lab between young preschool children and their mothers about emotional experiences that have happened recently in the child's life. And what we have discovered when we look carefully at them is that they are literally treasure troves of information about emotion. In one study I did with Lena Ontai, we coded emotion conversations, or at least the mother's part of them, according to different elements of the conversation. And these different colored lines reflect the strength of the relationship between these different elements of emotion conversation. And what you can see is that, mothers who talked often about emotions talked about the causes of emotions, they talked about the outcomes of emotions, they defined emotion, they requested the child give them further information about what they knew about emotion, and they did something we call linking events, which was to use an emotion that is being talked about and related to something in the child's experience. In one instance, for example, the mother is using the word frustration, and it's obvious her 4-year-old does not understand the meaning of frustration. So she pauses at this point and she says, both providing a definition and a linking event, she says, frustration is what you felt yesterday when Sissy knocked over your block tower. And you could see this child, he's thinking, then his eyes go wide and goes, oh, and now he understands what frustration is. And he understands it by linking his own experience yesterday with the experience of the story character that they're talking about. Here's an example of how this occurs. In this case, this is a conversation between a mother and her son, her 5-year-old, surrounding or relating to an event that happened yesterday when he shut off a video game he was playing with his friends because he thought his friends were picking on his character. And as the mother envelopes her child with her arms, she envelopes him with understanding conversation. She first talks about the causes of what happened and validates his feelings. She says, it's hard when you feel so angry, isn't it? You're going, he's bouncing my guy off there, right? And then she focuses on consequences, asking for more information. How did the other kids feel when you shut off the game? Contributing to emotion understanding. She also focuses on its current experience. Looking at his face, she asks, it makes you feel sad thinking about it, doesn't it? And then she does what good mothers do in this situation. She provides more information. She says, after you stop the game, the other guy said, Joey wasn't really doing so bad. You thought you were losing, but you weren't. Emotion conversations like these, therefore, not only help children understand the causes and consequences of their own feelings, but to link them to the feelings of others, and it provides children with support in managing these feelings and these experiences for themselves. And I want to emphasize, not everybody does this. We have found that these emotion conversations are distinct and special compared to, or in contrast to, the conversations we find in other mothers, where they adopt a much more pragmatic style, a much more, what we call kind of in the old Dragnet style, just the facts, ma'am. Talking about a recent experience, they simply talk about what happened and don't explore and delve into the inner experience of the people who are part of that narrative story. Pragmatic versus this style, which is elaborative. And as suggested by this picture in this narrative, what is important is not just what is said, but also how it is said. So in a further study, we coded not just the content of Mother's words, but her conversational style. So at the top, elaborative explanation, that's what we've been talking about. Causes, consequences, linking events, providing information. But this turned out to be linked to the mother's validation, just like the mother in the preceding slide did, affirming the child's emotional reactions, even if she disagrees with it, to say, I understand. On the other side, autonomy support, a bad label for basically what means affirming the direction in which the child is wanting to take the conversation. And finally, all this is linked significantly to what we call constructive emotion regulation coaching, because these conversations also often involve mothers helping children understand how better to manage their feelings in situations like this and in similar other situations. As important as these are, one of the important discoveries of this research was also that these elements of the quality of mother-child conversation were linked to a broader index we have of early parent-child relationships called the security of attachment. Children who have been able to develop that confident, trusting, warm relationship with their mothers often have mothers who have this conversational style that helps contribute to their understanding and support of a child's emotional life. Now let me pause at this point and make something very clear. Because I know this is a question that some students are wondering, does this work for fathers as well? And the fact is we think it does, but we haven't studied it yet. Why? Well, have you ever tried to get a father into a research lab? It is really tough. When I was at Nebraska, we thought we could make a deal with a football team to get free football tickets for fathers who'd come, but I left too soon to make that happen. So And in feed, I just want to suggest as a parenthetical comment that although we study mothers here, we're doing it to create models. I believe that the father-child conversational influence on emotion understanding may be as profound because of the unique role that fathers have in children's emotional lives, and particularly for those of boys. I just want to put that out there because I think this is, for the graduate students out here, a very important area of research that we need to get onto. A warm, secure mother-child relationship, therefore, is important to the growth of emotion understanding in young children and planting the seeds for compassion. And in a follow-up study that I'm going to present to you in just a moment, confirm this conclusion. In this particular sample, however, we decided we were going to look at a sample of economically at-risk families. We recruited these families from the Early Head Start program in our local community because we were aware that the experience of emotional development for a child growing up in the context of family stress may be very different from what we've been seeing in some of our middle-class families. So we saw these children and their mothers on 2 occasions. The second time was when the children were 3.5 years of age, and we used a straightforward measure of children's emotion understanding. And then we related that to some measures we'd obtained both at that time and in an earlier visit that took place when children were 2.5. Not surprisingly, we had a measure of the security of the mother-child relationship. You won't be surprised if I tell you that we found that there was a significant prediction here. Children who were in more secure relationships showed greater emotion understanding a year later compared to children who were insecurely attached. Now, we also obtained in this study measures of mother-child conversation quality at age 3.5 years. We wanted to see how this related to children's emotion understanding. We also found, however, that it was related to the security of attachment. As our research has also indicated, as I was suggesting earlier, mothers in secure relationships are simply talking with their kids in this more informationally rich, validational way. And so not surprisingly, too, that conversational quality also predicted emotion understanding. And when we brought mother-child conversation into the equation, it turned out that it completely explained the effects of a secure attachment. In other words, the power of a secure relationship for fostering children's understanding of their emotions and other emotions seems to be coming through the quality and the content of their conversations. And the reason this is so important in this kind of economically at-risk sample is that at age 2.5, we also had a measure of mothers' depressive symptomatology. It turns out that nearly a third of the sample of mothers were in clinically depressed levels of symptomatology. And we found that over the course of a year, that had a negative prediction to emotion understanding. Kids whose mothers were depressed were impaired in their understanding and appreciation of emotions. From this research, especially when children are in at-risk circumstances, supportive relationships are important. And that kind of secure attachment provides young children with a psychological secure base for exploring and understanding emotions. And I need to say, especially negative emotions, because those are the emotions that young children find most perplexing and most upsetting and most disturbing and most in need of assistance in making sense out of in themselves and in other people. Does this make sense so far? Okay. Then in the last bit of time that I have, I'd like to move forward, talking about how the emotionate child develops in the context of the experiences of intersubjectivity that begin in early infancy, by which the child begins to make a link between their own internal world and that of another through the gateway of emotions, and which expands in the context of parent-child conversations by which, in both the content and in the style of conversations, mothers help to unfold a child's emotional experience and connect it to others, and therefore plant the seeds of compassion, the kind of helping that we saw at 18 months and that we are seeing at 4 years. I'd like to talk about the broader implications then of what the development of the emotionate child means for 3 areas of research that we've been studying. One is the development of self-understanding, a second, the development of morality, and a third for social understanding. And I want to draw on the findings of our lab to illustrate these. First, with respect to social understanding. There we go. We used to think that young children had self-awareness that primarily focused on their physical abilities and their outward appearance. You ask a 5-year-old, what do you like? Tell me about yourself, and you're likely to hear something about the child's brown hair, blue eyes, the fact that they can run fast and climb trees faster than anybody else in their class. And we used to think that's where children's self-awareness began and ended. But we realized that in some respects, this may reflect limitations in what children can tell you. So a few years ago, researchers, including us, began using some more innovative procedures involving a puppet procedure. Children are introduced to 2 puppets. We sometimes name them Iggy and Ziggy. And they're told that these puppets are writing a story about children your age, and they will tell you something about themselves, and then you can tell them about yourself. And so as the interview proceeds, Iggy will say something like, I like to play by myself. Ziggy might say, oh, I like to play with friends. The child is asked, well, what about you? And children can say they're like Iggy, they're like Ziggy, or they're somewhere in the middle. And we ask multiple questions like that that tap into children's psychological self-awareness. One puppet says, I'm usually happy. The other puppet says, I'm not usually very happy. What are you like? I get scared a lot, says one puppet. The other puppet says, I don't get scared very much. Well, what about you? And what we have learned is that children do not respond randomly as if they had no idea what exists psychologically under their skins. They give us internally consistent, coherent responses across multiple questions that are moreover consistent with how their mothers and teachers describe them. So the question then is, how are children describing themselves in this way? What comes out of their awareness of themselves under their skin? And what we find from findings of multiple researchers, including our lab, is that early self-awareness has a strong emotional component, reflected in children's reports of their timidity, their agreeableness, how much they're accepted by other people, expressions of negative affect, which include, in one study, indications of what might be depression or anxiety or hostility. And most importantly, positive or negative self-concept. Children early on have a sense of being someone who's a likable person, a good person, or somebody who's not so much. We were interested, of course, in what contributes to individual differences in this, and particularly how we might predict positive self-concept at age 5, a time when self-concept is important for self-confidence and academic achievement. And you won't be surprised when I describe to you 2 of the things we looked at a year earlier in trying to predict which children would develop a positive self-concept. The first, you can guess, a secure attachment with the mother, that warm, affirming, validating, emotionally rich relationship. And we also looked at the mother's own report of stress or depressive symptoms. We found that both were significant. Security of attachment in a positive sense, children in these warm, secure relationships saw themselves more positively. Mother's stress and depressive symptoms, often related to broader factors in her own experience and in family life, a negative association. Children felt worse about themselves. The important thing is that both of these predictors capture the emotional experience of the child in a central relationship to their experience. It is emotion that is helping to organize self-concept. Turning to moral development, in the old days, we believed that for the most part, young children are primarily punishment and obedience oriented as it relates to their cooperation and compliance. But more recently, studies of what we now call conscience development in early childhood are focusing on many other features that contribute to children's motivation to get along with others, including how they think about issues, how they're feeling, their self-capacities for self-regulation, self-understanding, including their own sense of themselves drawn from this puppet procedure of being the kind of kid who likes to do the right thing and feels badly when they do the wrong thing. So in our study, we were interested in the influence of mother-child conversations during conflict episodes, which is when a lot of values get transmitted, when children were 2.5 years old. So we brought them into the lab, and we rigged some episodes to try to bring out conflict between mothers and toddlers. Now, anybody who's been the mother of a 2-year-old knows this is not hard to do. This is pretty easy. And so it was not hard for us. For example, we gave the child a chance to play with a wonderful assortment of toys, and then after 5 minutes, the mother was instructed to say, it's time for cleanup, and will you put these toys in different bins, please? Not very happy toddlers here. We also had the mothers working on a puzzle that we knew was too difficult for them while the mothers were occupied with a questionnaire, so they couldn't respond. Conflict emerges. And we looked at how they talked about this, and particularly what mothers said. Then we brought them back to the lab when the children were 3.5 years of age to look at conscience development in a resistance to temptation procedure. Now, if you've had any doubts about how mean we are, they'll be erased in just a moment. Because in this particular procedure, the child was asked by the mother to play with an uninteresting set of toys in a room, and then she left the room. In the same room, there was a whole shelf of really, really good-looking toys, and I know this because these were the toys we had culled from our kids' playroom. But the kids were told, these are toys for some other child, you need to play with these boring poker chips. The child was observed for 8 minutes. Halfway through, just to make it harder, an experimenter, research assistant, comes in the room and plays animatedly with several of the toys with obvious delight before returning them to the shelf and then leaving the room. Our question was, how long would children continue to resist playing with the toys? And this is the measure of conscience development at age 3. So our question was, looking at conflict conversation at age 2.5, what is going to predict children's heightened conscience? Here's what we coded for mother-child conflict conversations. Mothers who are here, tell me if this rings true. We coded how often she talked about rules, what has to happen right now, what's being expected. How often they talked about the consequences of actions, either good behavior, here's what happens when you do the right thing, here's what happens if you don't. We also coded, not surprisingly, the frequency of mothers talking about people's emotions, the child's emotions, her emotions, other people's emotions. We looked at moral evaluative statements, how often things that the child could do were deemed good things, or the child himself was described as a good boy, a good girl. We looked at how much mothers compromised or bargained with the child. And we also looked at how often she provided justification and reasoning, combined with a low use of threats, teasing, or an insistence on immediate compliance. The two conversational elements that most significantly predict conscience development 6 months later was first, how often mothers talked about people's emotions. And we think that what happens here is that what mothers are doing is to put a human face on issues of right or wrong, to talk about the human consequences of good or disapproved conduct, perhaps stimulating compassion in some circumstances. The other one was the mother's use of justification and reasoning, explaining why this is necessary, why we have to clean up the toys, and avoiding the use of teasing, threats, or insistence. This was one of 2 studies in our lab where we have never found that the mother's conversation about rules and the consequences of breaking them predicted children's conscience. It seems as if children are moved along. Values are communicated in lots of other contexts, but in the context of moral socialization, especially in conflict, talking about the human consequences of good and bad behavior is preeminent. Finally, we've also looked at the development of social understanding, because in the end, what we really want to understand is how the emotionate child contributes to a person's ability, to a child's developing ability, to get along with other people, to act in a socially appropriate and competent way. And the reason we think that these qualities of emotion, conversation, and the attachment relationship within which they exist are important is because of the ways in which early social experience contributes to children's understanding of the social world, which then predicts social behavior. Or in the words of a colleague of mine, these mental representations, these social representations, are a bridge between children's early experiences and their later expectations and behavior. We are fortunate in this case to recognize that emotion is a part of social understanding, and a very important part. In this particular study, we were able to benefit, not by having to gather our own data in this case. By the way, pay attention, graduate students, sometimes you don't have to gather your own data. But in this case, we used a sample that had already been drawn as part of the NICHD study of early child care and youth development, a sample of kids, more than 1,000 children and families, drawn from 10 sites nationwide, recruited immediately after the children were born, followed to age 15, and still followed now. A wonderful opportunity to use early measures of social development to predict later social behavior. Will anybody in this room be surprised that we started with the security of attachment and the rich emotional conversations these involved when children were age 3? So in a nutshell, here's what we found, predicting measures of social understanding 1.5 to 3 years later. First of all, kids who were more securely attached with mother we're less likely to show what we call a negative attribution bias. Now, this is technical language. Let me tell you what this is all about. It has to do with children's belief that in ambiguous circumstances, others have negative motives towards you. The simple example is this, and I've actually used it before. You're building with blocks, another kid is running by, the blocks fall down. Do you immediately leap to the conclusion that the other kid knocked them down? Or do you think that maybe it was probably an accident? Children who regularly conclude that the other kid tried to do me wrong have a negative attribution bias. A secure attachment is a safeguard against that. More positively, children who were securely attached at age 3 were higher in social problem solving at age 4.5, as indexed by the number of positive solutions they could come up with to common social problems in the peer group, like how do you make friends with another child? 3 years later, children who were securely attached to mother showed less loneliness, as indexed by their response to short interview questions like, how easy is it for you to make new friends? And again, 3 years later, they showed less of that negative attribution bias. Notice, please, how strong is the emotional dimension of early social understanding, indexed by positive or negative expectations of others, by positive, constructive social problem solving, and by the presence or absence of feelings of loneliness. The emotional understanding fostered by a secure attachment leads children to more constructive social expectations and more positive social skills with peers. This is the development of the emotionate child occurring in parallel with the concurrent development of the emotional child. So what do we learn from all this? Quite simply that emotions are foundational to early psychological development. This is why they can be sources of both vulnerability and resources for social understanding, self-awareness, and compassionate human connections. The emotional and emotionate character of young children depends significantly on the stress and support of their environments of care, especially their experience in close relationships. I like to think that when children think of the world in which they live, they do not primarily think of the physical environment that we often think of them in being. They don't think of the quality of their neighborhoods, their schools, or the relative advantages of their home environment. They think of themselves as being in an environment of relationships. And it's that environment of relationships that contributes the emotional resources that kids need. We've learned that emotions can be confusing, sometimes overwhelming to young children, and this is why what is said and how it is said in emotion conversation is important for understanding, managing, and enlisting emotions into psychological competence. And our research is beginning to show that the development of the emotional child has broader consequences. As a buffer to emotional vulnerability, as a support to emotional health, and as a contributor to positive, constructive orientations to others. I want to end as I began. It has been my honor to be with you this evening.
We now have time for questions from the audience. I'm going to invite you to raise your hand, and please, when you're called upon, stand and introduce yourself, and then put your question to Professor Thompson in a succinct way. Melissa Smith, Clara Mizukawa, and Alex Noor, students in the college, have roving microphones, and it's going to help if we could turn up the lights so that I'll be able to see who's asking a question. Here's a question on this side, Heather.
Hi, my name's Anna Maria Richards. I have heard some conflicting advice on how mothers are to respond in a negative emotional moment. So, for example, a child can't have a cookie. I've heard some researchers will say it's important that you label it. I know you're really mad, but you can't have that cookie. And someone else will say they're not really listening. They just know they can't have the cookie, so wait until later when it's all blown over, go talk about it after the fact. What would you say to something like that?
Well, like all of us, children are attentive to lots of things, even when they seem to be emotionally out of control. And a child who is raging at age 4 may sometimes not be in all clear why they're feeling or what they're feeling. That's where an adult's validation can be really helpful. And also because validation says your emotions aren't wrong, but we also have to go beyond. You are right, perhaps, in this context, to feel frustrated. But that doesn't mean I can give you the cookie. And that kind of sensitivity, I think, means a lot to children. I will tell you that we have actually done this in our research lab. I was telling the students earlier in a study that I did not describe to you this evening, that we had children work on some fairly onerous tasks and told them at the end that they could have a treat, a snack, to eat afterwards. And that it was okay for us if they had it now, but they should check with their mom. Outside the door, the mother is not told this, but she is told we've given the child a snack, but we prefer the child take it home and eat it there after the research is done. And then we observed them for 2 minutes during this denied request task, which was frustrating. And we found that mothers who were able to acknowledge the child's feelings, even while holding to what was the expectation, that these children were able to manage their feelings better. So, I hope this helped.
Question in the middle. Do we have a question here? Or on the side? Questions? Here's a hand over here, and while you're getting it, is there a question in the middle we can get a microphone to? Okay, please, thank you. Over here, please, name and question. On the side. Go ahead.
I was in competition with you. So. Okay, so I have a 7, or an 8, and a 10, and a 6-year-old, and I just wondered if there's any hope for all the damage that I've done. And I'm actually not being funny.
I often speak about early brain development because I am in a community of scholars at UC Davis where there are just brain images going all around, and also because I think that it's important to communicate brain science accurately to people that are out there. So let me tell you something that you may not have heard about. One of the most remarkable qualities of children's development, I'm going to get to your question. One of the most remarkable qualities of early brain development is the plasticity. That is the flexibility of the child's developing brain. And that gives us enormous hope. For children who are in situations that are traumatic, that when provided appropriate supportive interventions, that brain and that child will be capable of recovery. It's one of the reasons why the National Research Council concluded that early childhood is a prime opportunity for interventions to prevent emotional problems and instill emotional health. So when you're talking about children of your age, you're talking about still very plastic brains and brains that feed into personalities that are ready to respond to the good things we can give them.
So there still is hope.
There is still, not for us.
Question here, and then we can get a microphone on this side if we can, ready to go, over here in the middle. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Sherry Rowley, and I work at a local mental health agency with children, many of whom have been abused and neglected.
Yes.
And looking at some of this research that's been done, and I see some of these kids that come in around 5, 6, sometimes into the system, and they've been severely neglected and didn't have the secure attachment and some of these other things that you've discussed. How much research has been done with that? And I guess it kind of goes along with her question as to what can help, and then the parents that take these children into their homes later, you know, more mid-childhood, what can they do, or do you have things out there to helps them to know how they can improve the emotionality of these children?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. And it's also really a question that reflects that very productive intersection between basic developmental science here and intervention science. So what I can simply tell you is that there are a number of very, very promising and at this point now fairly well proven early intervention programs for children who have had traumatic or neglectful early life experiences that draws upon both developmental relational science, which I've been describing, and developmental neuroscience, which helps us better understand how the brain has been altered by early experiences of abuse or neglect. And within the context of the plasticity that we know will respond to appropriate environmental interventions. Now, this is probably not the time for me to try to talk to you about those programs in particular, but many of them rely on providing children with supportive substitute attachments that, while not undoing what the child's history has been in what may be abusive family relationships do give the child a different model of what relationships can be. So that when that child goes into a foster home or when that child encounters somebody else, they don't just have one model of an abusive relationship that is their default expectation for what this other person's going to do for me. They've at least got two alternative models that give them alternative expectations for how I might relate to this person and how they might relate to me. And that's a gift. And that's the beginning from which we begin helping these children being able to sort through what have been some very difficult early experiences and having alternative ways of being able to respond in the future. Is that helpful?
Question over here?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, I'm Monica Cole. In your case studies that you did it affect the outcomes if the mother had a history, like a longer history of being depressed, or if they had just gotten depressed after they had their child?
Right.
Does that make sense?
That's a very good question, because we know that postpartum depression in new mothers is at almost epidemic proportions in this country. Lots and lots of mothers are going through a very difficult time after the birth of the child, and it's a mental health challenge that is unrecognized. But your question is, does it matter when and how long the mother is depressed? So let me tell you something surprising about this study. I pointed out to you that it was when children were 2.5 that maternal depression predicted emotion understanding at age 3.5. You remember that? Well, we also had a measure of the mother's depression at 3.5. And of course, what you might ordinarily expect is that depression at the time we were measuring emotion understanding would have been the stronger relationship. It turned out it wasn't. So there was something important about age 2.5 as children are developing their initial emotional schemas, where the mother's depression seems to have been important. Now, a lot of these mothers were depressed on both occasions, but the really powerful impact seems to have been depression a year earlier rather than depression at the same time that we were looking at children's emotion understanding. So that is kind of getting us thinking a lot about what are the periods in which the child's susceptibility to what's going on in relationships, in close relationships, seems to be really important for the development of emotion understanding. We're still working on that one.
I think we've got a question ready here, but if we've got one over here that the microphone can go to, that'd be great. Let's go with this one first, if that's okay.
My name is Sarai Dodge, and I have a question about whether there's been any research concerning children who don't respond to emotion normally, like autistic children don't respond to these stimulating environments. Has there been any research looking at that?
Well, my university, in addition to doing a lot of brain imaging, is also kind of autism central. We have what is called the Mind Institute, which is a national center for work on autism and autism spectrum disorders. And so, in fact, I can tell you that there has been a lot of research looking at emotion. The story of autism and emotion is a kind of a different story, because their emotional deficiencies, at least deficiencies in emotional understanding, are a byproduct of broader deficiencies in psychological understanding that we think has a lot to do with the challenges that seem to arise very early on in how autistic children perceive what people are like, and begin to understand sort of what is the internal psychological world of people. And so, of course, emotion understanding is impaired, but is part of a broader challenge in just understanding what is all that internal network of things going on that cause people to act the way they do. As you can see, we know from the beginning at 6 months that babies are already getting this very non-egocentric awareness that other people have emotions that are different from mine, but that I can share. That's about the same time that we think we're beginning to understand that the developmental pathways for children with autism are diverging. So autism is a special case of emotion understanding, and we haven't yet unlocked where that core problem seems to be arising from.
Question over here, please.
Do you think that we could ever be overly sensitive to emotion? Like if you're just sitting there all day, oh my gosh, I think you're feeling this, and I think you're feeling this. Do you think that would ever be harmful in an opposite way for the kids?
Well, I'm absolutely confident that almost any good parenting practice can be abused. and exaggerated. And my wife, who's sitting here, who works with parents of young children all the time, I suspect could come up with some examples of that. Well, I think that part of the challenge here Part of the challenge is helping children understand that their feelings are valid and are worthwhile and are recognized, but so also are the feelings of others. And the core socialization challenge is, how do I put my own feelings and needs and desires in the context of a world where other people have equally valid feelings and desires and needs? And the answer is not to say that the child's feelings and needs are any less warranted, but the answer sometimes might be that you cannot have those things satisfied if it means running over the feelings and needs of another child. And that, I think, is where the effective parenting comes in. Did I answer that right?
We'll have two more questions. We'll get microphones to people. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask a quick question. You've talked a lot about mothers and hinted at research that might be productive about fathers.
Yes.
What about preschool teachers, or in the context of our faith, primary teachers?
Yes.
What can they do to model what you've talked about?
Yeah. No, when I talk about relationships, I am talking about the relationships on which children depend. When I talk about attachments, I'm talking about attachments to mothers and fathers. But young children quite commonly form attachments to those who are significant figures in their life. You might ask, who is a person that a child can expect to turn to for help when they need it? And that is a person to whom an attachment is likely to develop. So all the things we've been talking about concerning emotion conversation, both its quality and quantity, and earlier on, the development of that intersubjectivity, that sharing of emotion and intention, is something that can occur between a child and really any adult to whom they develop that kind of emotional bond. And I think that can be true of primaries, it can be true of preschool teachers, it can be true of those who are regularly providing care for children. It begins, of course, with parents, both mothers and fathers, who are the first teachers of all sorts of things. And that includes, of course, the teachers of emotion, and emotion in the context of getting along with others.
Okay. Question here?
How does, let's say the mother has more than one child under the age of 3, how does that secure relationship become affected, because she has to balance that?
Right.
Especially with the child's moral development, because in some cases the older child is kind of jealous of the new baby.
Yes.
So what's your comments on that?
Well, actually, I should ask some mothers in this group to perhaps offer their wisdom. I think that where most of us grew up with siblings, and part of the rich education provided by sibling relationships is exactly what I was referring to earlier. That education of learning that your feelings and needs are important, but so also are those of another child. And that lesson is nowhere better conveyed, oftentimes, than in a family context. The challenge for a parent, therefore, is how do you communicate at that child's level of understanding? And you've got two children who may be at very different levels of understanding. That kind of message. For an older sibling, it may require understanding that your needs are important, but this is a child with different needs, and that I have to devote some time to them, and you're going to get your special time. If not now, then a little bit later. And indeed, sometimes with a preschooler, you give them a clock, and you let them see that when the hand gets here, this is when mommy's going to be able to have special time with you. For a younger child, it's understanding what their older siblings' feelings are and how that relates to what the child's experience is, so that you can begin tutoring emotion understanding in that way too. It's not easy, and that's why this is such an important pursuit, this thing we call parenting.
Last question. Do we have one on this side? Okay. Whoever's got the microphone. The power of the microphone.
Yes, my name is Ann Anderson, and you talked earlier about children even up to 12 being able to go back and teach the emotions. Can we do that with adults?
Well, we can. But part of the story of brain plasticity is that the reason you want to get it right early is that it is both biologically and economically more costly to try to get it right later on. Okay? At times like this, I sometimes like to bring out the story of Amber, who was a child when Janet and I were in Lincoln, Nebraska, who was profiled by our local newspaper because she was suffering from uncontrollable epileptic seizures. And the doctors had concluded that after trying everything else, the only thing they could do that would help her was a hemispherectomy, literally taking out the half of her brain that was diseased in order to let her be released from the seizures. So the newspaper followed her up for a number of years. Amber was a 13-year-old child. And in a dramatic series of stories over the course of a year showed incredibly how the healthy half of her brain over time managed to assume many of the functions that the diseased half had formerly assumed. That's a good illustration of brain plasticity. Now, I got to tell you, you take out half my brain, there's no recovery. I mean, I don't have that kind of plasticity, and that's really the story. So the answer is yes, but it takes more effort because there is more, on a behavioral level, more unlearning to do, and on a neurobiological level, there are more new connections in the brain that you're having to make. Now, the good news is that the brain continues to make connections throughout life. The bad news is that as you get older, those connections become increasingly consolidated. And that's why we try to get it right at the beginning. Okay.
Professor Thompson, you mentioned a clock a moment ago, and that's as if on cue. We would like, as an expression of our appreciation, to present you with this clock to help you remember your visit to Brigham Young University. Engraved on the clock are the words, Marjorie Pay Hinckley Lecturer, 2001, Ross Thompson. Please join me in another round of applause for Dr. Thompson.